Start a Cubist assignment, and you've probably all seen Cubist type pieces of art. We're obviously not going to do a pure reproduction of something. We're going to modify it a bit. It is a 20th century art movement. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what it was all about, and you guys will get a chance to do a little bit more drawing from observation. Um, but basically using Cubism as an inspiration for creating really interesting compositions. So to do this week, you're going to need your sketchbook again, a pencil, and an object that represents something you feel strongly about and something that has interesting contours. A cell phone is not going to cut it for this assignment, unfortunately, because it's just too plain. It's just a flat rectangle. So find an object that is interesting from all different angles. So Cubism was the first abstract art movement, and I find it fascinating because when we look at things in the media or things online or anything like that, whenever we see visuals nowadays, we take it for granted that they are, they look a certain way. There is very little that is new and shocking about art or graphics that we see nowadays. But 100 years ago, back in 1907, two artists, George Braque, and they're going to talk about them a little bit in our video, were painting together, and they were influenced by Paul Cézanne, who was a French painter who died in 1906. And he started pushing the limits of realism in art. So up until that point, to be qualified as a good artist, you had to be really imitating nature. You had to make things that looked realistic. But it was about the same time that photography began to replace painting as a means for documenting people, places, and events. All of a sudden, this mechanical thing was available. You could get your portrait photograph taken, in under a half hour, and you didn't have to go sit for a portrait artist for weeks or months, and it was much more affordable. So all of a sudden there were artists put out of work, who were recording things, documenting things. So artists all over the world had to start thinking about, well, what is it that we're really doing? So these guys wanted a radical new way of seeing, and they wanted to challenge conventions of perspective that had been in place since the Renaissance for like 400 years. They broke up spaces and shapes to make people question what was real and not real. They challenged and confused the natural order of things. So they were the first people to approach art intellectually rather than just copying what they saw. And they deconstructed objects. They took them apart visually so that they could see how they were made. You would see all different sides of them. And their major concern was how to reduce the three-dimensional world onto a two-dimensional picture plane. How do you show something that is 3D as something that's flat? So we have a little 4-minute video here.
Cubism is often credited as being one of the most avant-garde, groundbreaking and revolutionary art movements. But what exactly is Cubist art, and who were the Cubists? The two most pivotal artists referred to as the inventors of Cubism are France's Georges Braque and Spain's Pablo Picasso. Back in the early 1900s, these two pioneers started to represent and depict their subject matter from multiple angles and viewpoints at the same time rather than from a single fixed position, which had been the norm prior to that. Despite the name of the iconic movement, neither Braque or Picasso ever painted cubes. The term itself actually originated from a derogatory remark made by an art critic in 1908. The critic had disparaged Braque by saying the artist reduced everything to geometric schemas, to cubes. The term soon became widespread. Cubism was born. Cubist techniques were evident throughout all of Picasso's work at this time. Tête, for instance, is one of his most celebrated artworks and the most abstract of all of his Cubist collages. The half circle drawn in charcoal depicts the profile of a head. The small circle and diagonal line with the arc represent an eye and nose. The pasted on elements represent the face, hair and neck. Within a few years, both Braque and Picasso began to incorporate letters into their Cubist works. Braque's Le Bougeoir, meaning the candlestick, from 1911, is a very early example of one of his paintings to include lettering. The purpose of this lettering was to question the relationship between words, pictures, and the objects they represent. Towards the top of the painting is a candle, which helps to identify the shape below as a candlestick. A simple clay pipe, the kind Braque smoked, lies to the centre right, and below that are a bobbin and a pair of scissors. Within a few years, a small group of artists based in Paris, including Fernand Léger, Robert Delaunay, and Sonia Delaunay, were following the lead of Braque and Picasso's abstract art. They wanted to emphasise the point that a painting is a flat surface, while the things they represented were three-dimensional. So instead of choosing a fixed perspective and presenting views as if seen through a window, they painted motifs as if seen from several different angles at once. The Cubist style quickly spread across Europe and America, with particular popularity burgeoning in Russia, where the style corresponded and chimed with newly forming revolutionary ideals. In Scotland, the work of artists like William Crozet also displayed a strong affinity with Cubism, as can be seen in this painting of Edinburgh from the late 1920s. Cubism soon splintered and morphed into various different styles across numerous different countries. The Italians had Futurism, the British had Vorticism, the Russians had Suprematism and Constructivism. It also inspired and influenced movements around the world in different creative disciplines, such as architecture, music, and literature. Given the far-reaching impact of the movement and its many exciting and important offshoots, the case can easily be made for Cubism as being the most radical and influential art movement of the 20th century. The Cubists constructed new realities, moving away from traditional ideas of representation, leading to abstraction.
So I think that's a really nice overview of what Cubism is. I've included a painting here by the artist named Clive Head, and it's from New York City. And so there are plenty of artists these days who are working, still influenced by the Cubist movement. And you guys are going to be influenced by the Cubist movement as well. What you're going to do this week is a preliminary step for next week's assignment. So the better job you do now, the better your final piece of art is going to be. Please choose an object that has interesting contours and that represents something you feel strongly about. You're going to make 3 drawings of it in your sketchbook, and each drawing needs to be from a different view. So you need to do like a top view, a side view, maybe a bottom view, or an angled view. Please don't do 2 side views because that's basically the same view, just facing in a different direction. Each drawing should take up most of the space of the page. So these examples that I've given to you here, I have no idea how large the original papers were that these were drawn on. But if you imagine like this tape dispenser, if you imagine this would be one of your drawings, this could be another one of your drawings, and then this could be a third one. And each one of them should try to fill up as much space on your sketchbook page as you can. And again, each drawing on its own piece of paper, contour lines only, no shading. This apple has some really nice little shading, but for the next step of your project, you really just want the outlines. So I'm obviously not going to take points off if you do shading, if you like that, but for now, you can stick to just the contour lines. Please measure your proportions to be as accurate as possible. And then the self-assessment point just basically says, look at your 3 drawings when you're done and ask yourself if you have all of the criteria listed on number 2 above. If not, figure out what you're missing or email me for help. So you're going to upload photos of all 3 of your views, and your rubric is right here. So you get 5 points for choosing an object that's meaningful and has interesting and complex contours. You get 15 points for the 3 sketches if you use the ratio method of finding the proportions to make them as accurate as possible. You get 15 points if you have 3 distinctly different views, and 15 points for each sketch filling most of the sketchbook page. So if we go back to these again, this one is really nice of the tape dispenser because you can see that he's got his ratio here and he's drawn his box and drawn them in. When you go from a side angle, it gets a little more complex. He still measured the width, he or she, I don't know if it was, I don't know the gender of the person. So they still measured the width and then they compared it to the height and then they found the angles to find those parts. Angle finding is really quite straightforward. I haven't demonstrated it to you, but I'll just really quickly, actually you can kind of see the bookcase behind me. The way to find an angle of something that you're drawing is you, again, you have your pencil in a straight arm and you hold it out in front of you and you tilt it one way or the other until it's lined up right on that line. And you want to make sure that you're not like pointing it away from you into space because that doesn't really work. You want to make sure that you are holding it parallel to your body and then you just basically drop that right down onto your paper and that is the angle of the line. So like I said, we'll do more of this measuring and angle work in class, but for this week's homework, we're looking for 3 different views of a interesting object that is meaningful to you.